But let's go ahead and get started. I'm Carrie Bourne. I'm from the Office of Continuing Education at UW-Whitewater. We host the Fairhaven Lecture Series each semester, and each semester we focus on a theme and then have 10 to 12 lectures on that theme. This semester we're talking about Native Americans, and today we'll be learning much more for sure. Today we have Michael P. Gueno, who is an associate professor in the Philosophy and Religious Studies Department at UW-Whitewater. After graduating with a BA from Louisiana State University, he went on to receive his MA and PhD in religion from Florida State University. He specializes in American religious history and Native American religions in particular. He has researched and written on a range of Native American groups and topics, from the effigy mound cultures of Wisconsin to the Pueblo religions of colonial New Spain to the relationship between Native American religions and contemporary U.S. legislation. Please welcome Michael Gueno.
It is a pleasure and an honor to get invited to be a part of this series. It's an opportunity that I definitely can't turn down. A chance to share my passion for studying Native American cultures with others and to actually be able to talk to an audience of people who want to be here. So unusual. It's great. So today's topic was entitled Native American Spirituality and Practice. And so the obvious question is, why call it that and not something like Native American religion? It's a complicated question. The easy answer is Native American spirituality and practice sounds sexier than Native American religion, and people show up if you throw in the word spirituality. But the question remains, is there such a thing as Native American religion? Spirituality is something that we have a vague sense of, and religion, again, we don't exactly have a clear definition, but we have a vague sense of it. So, before we can answer the question, is there such a thing as a Native American religion, we have to recognize that there are some obstacles to coming up with an answer. The first is that there's no such thing as a Native American. When I say Native American or American Indian or Indian, typically one of a couple of images comes to mind, like of a lone Indian brave sitting on horseback as they amble towards the horizon, or an Indian grandmother on her front porch holding a baby, looking off the sunset with wrinkles lining her face. Whatever the image is, it's usually a single image, a picture of a Native American. And there is no such individual group or person. Native Americans were an incredibly diverse group of peoples and cultures. They differed in every conceivable way from one another. In terms of arts and architecture and technology, some would be really advanced in one area and be completely lacking in another aspect. If they were so diverse in terms of architecture, in terms of dress, in terms of how they got their food, in terms of how they organized themselves, of course they're going to be incredibly diverse when it comes to beliefs and practices. The other obstacle in trying to answer the question, is there such a thing as Native American religion, is that the question itself is a Euro-American question. The word religion is not a word that has an equivalency in most Native American languages. It's a Western term, a Western concept with a long and complicated history. The idea of religion emerged in Western history in conversation with Christianity. And Christianity at different times either defined itself as not a religion. It's just the way, and all of those fake things are religions. Whereas other times they said, yes, we Christians are a religion, and everything else is either heathenry or idolatry. And it's gone back and forth with different Christianities either claiming the term or rejecting the term. Today we have a vague notion of what religion is, but not a definition. Most Americans would say that religion is something having to do with belief, that it has something to do with a higher power, or maybe God. But as Western cultures interacted with other peoples in the world, our concept of religion had to change. What was once just about belief in God had to become belief in gods, plural. And then once we came into contact with cultures that didn't just have defined gods, but had some sort of underlying spiritual essence, we changed gods to higher power, which opens the door for religion starting to be just about anything. But still, we tend to focus on belief, and yet if I asked you what religions have, we could come up with a long list other than beliefs that religions must include for us to think of them as religions. You gotta have beliefs, you gotta have stories, you gotta have a sense of purpose or meaning, you gotta have rituals, you've gotta have sacred places that you gather, and the list would go on and on. So why do we prioritize belief? Is it because that's what's most important to religion, most fundamental to religion, or simply what's most important to the religion that most of us are most familiar with? Belief was not the most important part of what we would call Native American religions. Religion, whatever else it might entail, when you look at all the religions of the world and you start to look for some sort of unifying theme or function or essence, religion is a way in which an individual or a group or a people realizes their cosmos, makes real the universe that they live in. It's the ideas, the beliefs, the frameworks, the thoughts, the deeds, the structures, the institutions that helps them to concretize, make true, make experiential what is before that only ideas. Religion is a way in which an individual and a group and a people allow themselves and help themselves to situate themselves relative to everything that is. A way in which you come to understand and situate yourself relative to yourself, relative to your family, relative to your community and your home and your homeland and the universe around you. However else we might define religion or expect religion to include, religion is that thing. And Native Americans do have a that. Whether we call it spirituality or religion, this idea of relationality reveals arguably the central theme within Native American religion, and that is kinship. For Native American cultures, this world is defined by an interconnected web of familial relationships. You can understand how to interact with anyone, any person, anything by understanding how you are related to them. And you are related to them in some way. Kinship, the concept itself, especially for Native American communities, is more than blood. We might talk about a family of people that we are related to, but when we're being honest, sometimes we admit that our family is more than just the people we're related to by genetics. Your friends, the people who care for you, the people who love you, the people who have an active role in your lives, this is your kin. And same too for Native American cultures. Most Native American religions have rituals, have life ways that allow you to make kin a group of people or an individual that previously you had no connection to. You do a ritual and suddenly this person is now a member of your group, of your people. They are to you as a brother or as a sister or as a mother. And kinship has defined family relationships. You relate to your mom different than you did to your daughter. And there are structured ways you're supposed to relate to each. Did you love your mama? Most people, even people who hate their mama, love their mama. Right? It is taught to you. It's hammered in. And did you feel the same way about your mom as you did your dad? A little bit different. Which one was supposed to be the more authoritative one? I did say you're supposed to. Society usually tells you it's dad, right? But in reality, you kind of know it's mom. And you know that you're supposed to treat these people in slightly different ways. And if you treat them right, they treat you right. So when you understanding how to relate to another human being, you have to know what the proper kinship relationship is to that person. Someone who's like your grandparents' age but not actually your grandparents is kind of like a great uncle. Someone who's kind of like your dad but not exactly your actual father is kind of like an uncle. You treat them the way you treat that member of the family, and they then in turn are expected to treat you as a member of that family. That includes non-humans too. Most Native American religions recognize that you are bound, you are related to all of the other things that are out there. We would call them spirits, gods, goddesses. When you understand how you are related to them, the relationship, you treat them according to the proper relationship, and you can then expect that they will treat you that way. If the son is father, or if you know about the corn mothers who are grandmothers, or the rattlesnakes that are cousins, if you treat them appropriately, you might expect that they treat you in the same manner. Kinship is the way in which you understand your place in everything. In that light, nature is going to be understood, and it's nature that plays an extremely powerful role in Native American religions. All of nature, this natural world, this universe we find ourselves in, is just one big, vast, interconnected web of family relations. Human beings, animals, plants, the sun, the moon, all of those supernatural entities or spirits that are out there, we are all part of the same thing, the same network of interrelated, interdependent, and reciprocal relationships. So the human beings, the natural world, the supernatural world, we are all part of one interconnected family, so to speak. As much sense as that makes to us, I have to complicate that a little bit with the term supernatural. I use that word because that's a word in English. It's a word that we know what it means, more than natural. But there was no such concept or term in Native American religion. Supernatural means something other than nature, something more than nature. But most Native American religions pictured not a world of physical and spirit, but one entire world of the same thing. So just as much as you see little squirrels running around up trees, so too there might be little spirits that are running around through those limbs. You may not see them, but they are just as real and just as there as the squirrel is. And just as you understand how to relate to a snake that is treated as a cousin, so too you learn how to relate to the moon who might be mother. And both are just as real and just a part of this same one world that we ourselves walk in. When we pass over from this life to the next, we might move on to an afterlife in many Native American religions. But that place of the spirits or of the dead is still a part of this world, this natural world. It might be beyond the heavens, or it might be just over that hill. But it's still a part of this one unified reality. Like most Native American religions, like most religions, Native American religions also have a role in structuring authority and power. Any culture we look at, religion is inseparable from existing power structures. Religions help tell you who has power, why they have power, when they have power, over what subject matters they have power, as well as having a role in shaping less formal structures of power like gender norms. Native American religions are the same. They help to give identity to a tribe. They help to break up a tribe into different clans to give meaning to those clans, to explain why we are broken up into those clans and why each of these clans must work together, why each one is equally important and necessary to the function and health of the other. It explains what it means to be a man or to be a woman. How do you behave appropriately in those roles? What authorities and power you have in each of those roles. And in some native cultures, there's more than just two genders, which will also have their own unique rights and responsibilities, just like the genders we're more familiar with. In terms of religious leadership, Native American religions have that too. We call them shamans. They are what I call religious professionals, people whose job it is to do religion full time. You can call them a priest or a minister or a preacher. We just, when talking about Native American cultures, call them a shaman. They're the people that have the knowledge of how to interact with the spirit world. When things go wrong, they're the ones that are able to tell you what went wrong. They're the ones who know how to fix it. If some misfortune is plaguing us, they're the one who can tell us what spirit we have offended, what ceremony needs to be done to make our relationship with that spirit right again. Shamans. They can be called by vision. In some cultures, it's an inherited position. Sometimes you're a shaman if the previous shaman picks you out as the next one, whether you want it or not. In other cultures, you're a shaman if you've had some sort of traumatic childhood experience, been near death and been healed, or maybe if you were born with some sort of physical malady. It varied from culture to culture, but most Native American religions have these shamans. If religion is going to have a role in shaping and defining kinship and saying who has the power and who doesn't, then obviously religion plays a central role in communal togetherness, I guess, in binding a community together. Religion helps to give form and meaning to social structures, clan divisions, why they're important, ceremonies that each clan is supposed to do. What power does the chief have if we have a chief? What power does the shaman have if we have a shaman? Or a father? What we would consider spiritual power or religious power was not something held just by a few in Native American cultures. The shaman would have ceremonies that only he could do, but so too would the chief, the civil chief, the war chief, the rain chief. They would all have special powers, special ceremonies, special responsibilities that were theirs and theirs alone. So religion was entwined with the creation of leadership and authority and respect and all of those structures that create the society that we live in. And religion is that force that makes sure the stuff that this society needs to have happen actually happens. Religion galvanizes people, gets a community to make sure that the farming gets done when it's time for the farming. When we need to hunt together for increased communal success. When we go to war, we need to go to war together. Religion is the thing that pulls us together, joins us together as a people, gets us to focus our efforts on these really important activities. Religion is what's going to teach you how to do these activities and to justify when you do those activities, whether it is farming or hunting or warfare. But as your societies change, as your situations change, religion is there too, to help you negotiate that change, to make sense of it, to understand it, and to survive it. Religion helps you make sense of regular and mundane changes, like life cycle transitions. Most Native cultures are going to have rituals that help to bring attention to and make happen those transitions from one phase of life to another, like when a boy becomes a man and a girl becomes a woman, and when you go from being a single person to now a part of a household supposed to have kids, or when it's time to move on from this life to what comes next. Religion has something to bring attention to these transitions and to help people make sense of them, as well as to make sense of more dramatic changes, like when Native American religion came into contact with Christianity. Religion helped to give voice to the voiceless in the face of missionary efforts. It allowed them a foundation and a strength to voice opposition to the imposed Christianity. It allowed them to understand why this was happening to them, sometimes to embrace this new religion, sometimes to reject it, sometimes to create a third category that was neither Native American nor Christian, but something that was both and neither, that allowed these two religions and two peoples to come together. Religion throughout Native American history is going to inspire movements and innovations to help a Native individual or help Native people survive in the face of traumatic social change. But the question remains, is there such a thing as a Native American religion? That question itself and religion itself has been a point of conflict between Euro-American cultures and Native cultures. When we think of religion in the West, we tend to think about a religion that is either true or false. And if this religion is true, then it must be true for everyone. And that's not the way Native American cultures had their spirituality, religion, their life way. These are our stories, these are our practices and our beliefs, and they are true for us. And the people next to you, the nearby clan or tribe, they have their stories, their life ways, their rituals, and they are true for them. While they might have had different beliefs and practices, while they might have had something that we call religion, Native American cultures do not seem to have ever gone to war over differences in it, because that's not the understanding of truth within Native American cultures. Throughout the history of interacting with Euro-American settler colonialism, Native American religions have been, targeted for systematic termination. During colonization, missionaries would try to find out what they could about Native American religions so that they could better use that to root them out. During the policy of forced removal, we disregarded Native American religions as the superstitions of a backwards and primitive people. During the war policy of the U.S., that's the period where we tried to forcibly exterminate Native Americans, Native American religion was simply an obstacle to be ignored, lest it draw attention to the common humanity of the people that we are committing genocide against. But it's during the peace policy that Native American religion really endured its worst violence. The peace policy is what gives rise to many of the horrors of the boarding school period, when Native American children were taken from their parents and sent off to boarding school. And in boarding schools, they had Christianity forced upon them along with English, as well as indoctrination into how to disrespect your family elders. Religion was a part of what it meant to be an American during the peace policy period. Between the 1800s and 1954, Native American religion was actually formally against the law in the United States. Native American dances, ceremonies, traditional practices, and beliefs were outlawed. Not until 1954 were Native Americans actually allowed to practice their religion openly and freely. During the 1960s and 70s, as a result of attention brought to the plight of Native Americans by activists, especially the American Indian movement, Congress finally had to act. In 1878, in recognition of some of the past failures of the United States, Congress passed the American Indian Religious Freedom Act, which, let's make sure I get my language right, which sought to protect the religious rights, traditional religions, and cultural practices of American Indians, Eskimo, Aleut, and Native Hawaiians. These rights were to include, but are not limited to, access to their sacred sites, freedom to practice their ceremonial and traditional rites, the use and possession of their sacred objects, and, as a consequence of that, repatriation of some of their sacred objects that have historically been interned within museums. This AIRFA is a huge step towards religious liberty for Native Americans. It recognized some of the failures, some of the mistakes of the United States, and started to move towards establishing religious liberty for Native peoples. But it didn't actually include any provisions about how to enforce it. So it was sort of a failure in its actual implication or application. In recognizing that, Congress came together in 1994, passed House Resolution 4155 that works as both U.S. law and a joint resolution. And in June 20th, 1994, the federal government thereafter was to ensure that federal lands must be managed in such a way as not to undermine or frustrate the traditional religions of Native Americans. House Resolution 4230 went further still to protect the use of peyote and controlled substances within the use of Native American religious ceremonies. But still, you know that Native Americans do not have access to many of the sites recognized as sacred by their people. Still, they do not actually have the freedom to practice and perform many of their traditional religious practices. Because of the First Amendment. The First Amendment guarantees the freedom of religion, right? The free exercise thereof, right after the no establishment or disestablishment clause. But what does free exercise actually mean? Typically when people hear the word free exercise, we Americans mean the ability to practice your religion. That's what most of us think we have by free exercise. But in the United States, the term free exercise has historically been defined by the Supreme Court as the ability of each American to reach, hold, and change their beliefs according to the dictates of their conscience. Free exercise in the United States means your ability to believe anything you want. The government can interfere and stop your ability to practice the beliefs that to practice the things, the activities that flow from those beliefs. So Native Americans can believe anything they want in the United States. They have that freedom of religion now. But any practice or access to any sacred site or anything that those beliefs might mandate or require is not protected. It's not guaranteed, and is the result of ongoing national and state-level legislation. So that's my quick overview. I was told to do this in 30 minutes. The introduction to Native American religion that I normally cover, which you just got in 30 minutes, normally takes me 2 weeks. So that was the 30-minute version. But I was told that we get to have questions now. So this was the big overview, what Native American religion is all about, some of the central themes and ideas, and some of the problems faced for Native American religion in America today. But I have nowhere I need to be for a while, so if y'all have questions, I would love to get some.
So if you raise your hand, I'm going to come around with the microphone so we can hear it in the back.
Thank you. You mentioned that the Native American groups did not fight among themselves because of religious beliefs. Mm-hmm. Okay. Was it did they fight just like the Europeans did because of greed or not enough space, or they wanted somebody else's land, or how did that go? Because I just, you read about the Iroquois were warlike, and I just wonder if they were fighting among themselves, wouldn't they understand war with the whites a little bit better?
Mm. The easy answer is that it's complicated. I remember I said about diversity. So when talking about Native American cultures and war, it's going to be the same thing. Some Native American groups were completely pacifistic, would refuse to go to war, and saw the shedding of human blood as the greatest of spiritual offenses, whereas other cultures went to war every time the snows thawed. When the snows thawed, spring came, it was time to go to war, and you would go to war with a local group that you've gone to war with every year previously. That was just the way of life. In times as to why do people war, we in the West tend to think that it's because of scarcity, that we fight over common resources, and that's the main reason. But some indigenous communities actually would go to war just because it was easier. You could wait for someone else to clear a spot of land, to make a tillable field. It's a lot easier to go and just kill them after they did that than to actually clear their land. And if you happen to lose a couple of people on the way, there's less mouths to feed. Win-win. Other groups went to war for, well, reasons we can't exactly be too clear of. They went to war, but there was more than enough land or resources in the area for both groups to have been able to exist. When we think about war today, it's not always just because of pragmatic reasons. You think of religion. Sometimes you're going to war not because you're disagreeing with their beliefs, but you believe that they are wrong, evil, that somehow there might be something that your spirits or gods command you to do that requires them to not be there anymore. What about emotions? People go to war for hate, for love. When we think about ancient Greece or modern day, we can attribute these same complicated motivations. So even in the absence of evidence for early peoples, just because we don't have a lot of evidence and documents, we have to assume the same level of complexity. So we don't know exactly why. We see no evidence of them going to war or having conflicts of belief, but they did go to war.
Okay, we have a few questions back here. We'll go here first.
Were there female shamans?
Yes. Yeah, it depends on the culture. In some Native American groups were strictly patriarchal and male-dominated. Others were matriarchal. Some were patrilineal, and all of the rights descended through the male line. Others were matrilineal, and the rights descended through the female line. In terms of religious power, some cultures had male shamans. Some didn't really matter. If you were touched by the spirits in the appropriate way, you were a shaman, and gender or sexuality made no difference. In some cultures, really what we would call a shaman was everybody. Among the Pueblo, everyone, as a part of getting to adulthood, was given additional teachings and ceremonies that only an adult member of this community could do. And this would be for both the men becoming men and the women becoming women. And then you had people who sort of did more ceremonies than other people, and they would be what we would call chiefs or shamans. So religious leadership or power was far more diffuse than we tend to think of it. But yeah, for Native American cultures, quite often sex and gender was not a limitation to religious authority.
Okay, there was over here.
Well, when the Spanish were down in Mexico and they met the Indians, they basically intermingled with them.
Yeah.
Whereas in the U.S., we saw the Indians as our enemy. Why was that?
Both happened in both places. Among the Spanish missionaries, you can read their accounts. Some saw the Native Americans as essentially the ideal fertile ground for Christianity. They were the ideal human, not being corrupted by the sins of Europe, and so they were ripe for just receiving this Christian message. Great human beings. Whereas other Spanish missionaries saw them as subhuman beasts and questioned whether or not they even had souls. So too did English settlers. Some of the Puritans saw Native Americans as essentially the next ideal Christian, that the Native Americans would produce the true Christian church that all of the world would see and sort of model themselves after. Whereas others wrote that when they looked in the faces of these dark savages, they saw the face of Satan staring back. Within Spanish lands, New Spain, you do get hybridization, intermarriage, intermingling between Spanish and the indigenous population. You get the same thing in the English colonies. They just don't talk about it as much. The Spanish recognized it. They recognized and created different ethnic categories for people of mixed ancestry, whereas English colonists just left it in the margins of their diaries. So white people were becoming a part of Native American cultures. Native Americans were living in English towns within the first 20 years of English settlement, but you never hear it talked about, nor is that a part of our image of the Native American. It's always leathers and feathers, not ruffly shirts and blue jeans. But both are true.
Was monogamy a part of the Indian culture before it was imposed upon them by Christianity?
Diversity. Sometimes. The common myth is that Native Americans were all polygamous, right? And that the men would have multiple wives. If you read the accounts of a lot of the Catholic missionaries, that's the version you would get. And yet polygamy was probably the most common social practice, but it was very seldom a historical reality. Many cultures would allow a man to have multiple wives, assuming that her family, whoever the next wife was, would agree to the match, and on the condition that he could care for all of his wives sufficiently, which very few people in a community could do, typically only the chief. And so if a person was allowed to have multiple wives, it's really the chief has the possibility of having multiple wives. And just like for kings and queens getting married, quite often those multiple wives were ways to bring communities together or to solidify political alliances. Most Native American cultures, most Native American people practiced what we would call serial monogamy. So you are married, you have one spouse, and that is your spouse until such time as this union is dissolved, usually by either party. And then both parties are free to go on and take another spouse. So it was one spouse at a time. And typically both men and women had the power to dissolve that union for any reason.
Could you tell us something about burial practices?
Sure. Most Native American cultures have some sort of way to deal with the remains of the dead. Since Neolithic cultures, most human beings treat our dead with respect. It's one of the sources that we cite as evidence of some sort of belief in something after this, because we treat our dead as though the way we treat them matters. Most Native American cultures did bury their dead. We know around here, a lot of Native cultures created burial mounds. Some cultures did that. Others would bury their dead in cemeteries. Others would cremate. Some would actually expose their dead on scaffolding, allowing the body to deteriorate until it was simply bones. And a friendly clan would then strip the bones of its remaining flesh, clean them, and then present them to the tribe whose dead we're talking about. They would then take this nice clean bundle and then inter it in a charnel house, a family house of bones. So it varies from group to group. And often my guess is that it tends to be based on the climate, right? Around here, we did the exposing on the scaffolding thing. Well, have you ever tried to dig during the winter? Right. It's a lot easier to expose the bones over the course of winter, and then when you can actually dig, that's when you take the bones and you inter them. In the Southwest, didn't really matter. So you take the dead, you wrap them up, you stick them in the ground any time of year, and you get essentially drying out mummification. But they're all going to have some sort of burial rite. And beginning after the 1800s, Native American cultures start to share a practice that was originated within the Sioux and starts to become a little more common, called ghost keeping. That actually allows you to evoke the spirit of the recently deceased and keep it with you for the next year. So imagine when someone dies and you have things that you wish you could have told them while they were alive, but you never had the chance. Or you felt that you weren't able to truly treat them the way that they deserved while they were alive. This practice of ghost keeping, which becomes more and more common, you can find them in most cultures today, allows you another year to say those things that you wish you could have said, and to show that person that respect and that love that they needed in this life so that they can freely move on to what comes next. Yeah.
More questions? Oh, yeah, sorry.
In the sweat lodges, what would be the difference between the male and the female sweat lodge?
In terms of practice, nothing. The sweat lodge is a ritual as well as a sacred space. The earliest we can find is related to the Sioux culture. But again, in the 1800s, as Native cultures start to come into increasing contact, we start to see a greater diffusion and commonality of some of their practices, including the sweat lodge. Sweat lodge is this big dome that you go into and you sweat. It's a big dome. There's heated stones on the inside, a fire on the outside to heat those stones. You bring in the hot stones, you pour water on it, it steams, gets really hot. And then to make things better, you start to also pass around a pipe. After a period of time, and there is no defined period of time, there will be a series of prayers. The various powers of each direction will be evoked and granted thanksgiving. And the hope is that through this process of sweating and smoking and giving each of the spirits their due, you will be purified of any spiritual contaminations and made ready for whatever you're asking to do next. It was a preliminary exercise before what you would go on a vision quest, or before you do a sun dance, or before you do anything else. And both men and women could do those something else, whether vision quest or sun dance. But if you're sitting around sweating, it might be seen as inappropriate to be doing that in mixed-gendered company. So you might get a man and a woman sweat lodge.
Okay.
How many tribes practice the sun dance? Do you know?
Much like the sweat lodge, it was first found in a Sioux culture. But the term Sioux now refers to dozens, hundreds of subgroups, including the Dakota and the Lakota, with dozens and hundreds of subgroups in each of those. And in the 1800s, during this westward migration, the sun dance, as well as the circle dance and the ghost dance, were religious movements that started to spread across cultural lines as something that different peoples could do together to build a sense of commonality between groups, begin to build a sense of shared identity. So whereas before I was Lakota and you were Apache, as we do this ritual, we start to recognize that, yeah, we might be Lakota and Apache, but we're both Indian, and we have something in common. So the Sundance started to proliferate across cultures. It was the Sundance that was most strictly targeted during that ban period, and was hounded out of existence as far as white overseers were concerned. And of course, in the reawakening of Native American identity and vitality in the 20th century, the Sundance was seized by a lot of groups, many of which never practiced it before, as a way to sort of reclaim that Native American pride. So, hard to say.
Can you tell us something about the coming of age practices in the various Indian tribes?
Sure. These will differ greatly from culture to culture. Nearly every Native American culture that I can think of has a male equivalent, has a male coming of age ceremony when boys become men. Most would have a female equivalent, at least for women. For the men, it could include your first successful hunt. A boy, when he was becoming close to age among the Osage, would be given a bow and arrow. And whenever he killed his first animal, that was when it was recognized that he became a man. And a huge feast was held for him back in town. And then another feast would be held every time he killed a different species, which is evidence that sometimes religion is just a good excuse to have a party. Among other cultures, the Pueblo, I'll mention them again, when a boy starts to exhibit male interests, then he moves off from the house of his mother and father and moves into the bachelor pad. It's a place for single adult men to live. And there, once he initially arrives, he will begin to be taught those things that men need to know. That includes, of course, the obvious things that men need to know, as well as the ceremonial teachings. Now that you are an adult member, now it's time for us to tell you those things that you didn't know about as a kid. Those additional teachings, the ways that we relate to the spirits that now only an adult is ready for. And then after receiving these teachings, the first time he engaged in a ceremony, that's when he became a man. Very different for men. For most women, if there was a ceremony, it tended to take place the first time a woman demonstrated biologically that she was no longer a girl. The coming of her first menses. And in most Native cultures, when that happens, there's going to be a place on the outskirts of town where she will go and be secluded with the elder women of the community. I can't really tell you much about what happens there. Within history, it doesn't get recorded. Only women are allowed to go into that hut. Men are not. Most anthropologists have been men. What happens in that secret according to the men what happens in that hut according to the men in the village, we don't know. They go there and the women teach her the things that she needs to know as a woman. I don't know what that is because I'm not a woman. And so it doesn't get recorded by missionaries or later anthropologists. And today, if you are accepted enough by the tribe to be allowed to be a part of it, then you respect the tribe enough not to reveal what takes place in there. So she gets secluded for about a week. When it's done, she'll go through a purification bath usually and then be presented to the village, all dolled up and dressed up as only a woman can be, and presented as a legitimate potential marriage partner.
Okay, I'm coming.
Sorry about that. I have, I guess, 3 questions about effigy mounds. First of all, who decided which ones were to be burial mounds? Second of all, who decided which animal shape they were going to use? And third, did they get it all done, the large ones, did they get it all done in one season, or did they have to come back?
Yeah. We don't know. We talk about Native American culture and effigy mound cultures, but the plural there needs to be emphasized. Here we can see effigy mounds, and effigy mounds, if you didn't know, it's a very Wisconsin thing. Wisconsin and adjoining states. We are the place where those mounds get built. The best guess is that some of the cultures that were already here underwent a dramatic transformation when another culture from the south moved up in the territory. Then a bunch of cultures that had previously not really had a relationship together suddenly started to grow together, think of themselves as one people. As part of this new sort of cultural identity, there was a religious component too. It seemed to be as much a religious movement as a cultural movement. And this manifested in the creation of effigy mounds. Whereas before they were just building these little hemisphere or cone-shaped burial mounds, suddenly you get the creation of these much more elaborate effigy mounds, mounds in the shapes of something. We still don't know why. We don't know what these images mean. Some have theorized that these mounds represent different clans, clan totems, and that the person perhaps buried inside might be a member of that clan, except not all effigy mounds have people buried inside. And if a given culture had as much variety in terms of clan makeup as their making of mounds would indicate, one group of people might end up making 15 different animal shapes. And if one community had that many subdivisions, it seems very unlikely that that community would have enough solidarity, enough togetherness to last very long. Probably not clan symbols. They could be inspired by a vision. Maybe if you had a vision that you needed a mound made of this, a mound made in the shape of a hawk, you would have it in the hawk. Maybe it was inspired by something about the local vegetation. It could be some sort of attempt to balance the cosmos. It seems that areas in get my Wisconsin geography right, areas in the eastern part of the state tend to have more water-related effigies, lizards, snakes, water spirits, and that tends to be areas that tend to be wetter. Yeah, lots of lakes. Get my geography right? More lakes that way? And yet, whenever you have in any sort of site some sort of water spirit, you also have balance in that site something from the upper realm, something like a bird. So were these effigy mounds ways of trying to evoke the spiritual powers of different realms of existence and balance them cohesively? It's another theory. I wrote a paper about a theory, but I don't want to just, teach my theory as being true because I got enough criticisms on it already that apparently people don't think it is. But the easy answer is we don't know, and I don't want us to assume that we do know. Yeah.
Other questions? Yeah.
What about tobacco and other mind-altering substances as part of their religion?
Yes.
And how it found its way into our culture?
Contrary to what has become popular Western belief, most Native American cultures did not have ethnogens, hallucinogenic substances. It's sometimes believed that every culture had this, and it's been used by a lot of people who want to find a biological explanation for religion to say that, well, they were all hallucinating, and religion comes from people tripping a lot. It's not the case. Some cultures did have hallucinogenic substances. Peyote, as an example. You find it in the Central America, and it migrates its way up north. but it was by no means a universal practice. Tobacco was initially found within really the Mississippian culture. So from the American Southeast up the Mississippi River and really anywhere the Mississippian culture connected, and that includes Wisconsin. They had tobacco. And if tobacco doesn't seem like a mind-altering substance to you, they were smoking what we call Nicotiana rustica, which is the indigenous pure strain of tobacco, which has 2 to 3 times the nicotine of our current strand. Plus, it wasn't being filtered or cut. You smoke that, and sure enough, you can get an experience. Smoking tobacco was a part of some Native American cultures, but not all. As Native cultures come into contact and begin to share practices and beliefs, so too does the practice of smoking tobacco disseminate. Today, most cultures have tobacco as a part of the religion. Why? It is seen as an offering that all spirits find pleasing. So this spirit might like corn as an offering, and this spirit might like sweet breads, but all spirits like tobacco. It's an offering like incense or wine in other cultures that would seem pleasing to all the supernatural beings. And that includes also human beings. The smoking of tobacco makes spirits agreeable, makes spirits happy. And so if we, as a community, were to smoke tobacco, then it would make our spirits agreeable, make us more easy to find agreement and consensus among us. But remember what I told you, that there was no difference, that there was no indigenous word for religion? So the smoking of tobacco was often something done as preparation before a ritual. But a ritual is any sort of thing done in a formal manner. So that would include a vision quest, or a ceremonial dance, or a formal negotiation, which is why you get the idea of the peace pipe and the smoking of tobacco before peace negotiations. That's the easy answer. Most Native cultures that smoke it today don't smoke it straight. They make various mixes, mixing tobacco with what's called kanik, as well as various barks, like sweet gum bark, that add flavors as well as have spiritual relevance. The relevance, of course, will vary from culture to culture.
So I think we'll leave the Q&A part there, but Dr. Gueno can answer questions if anybody would like to ask questions. But please join me today in thanking Dr. Michael Gueno. Thank you.
Thank you.